Hello everyone, welcome back to Biznesowo po angielsku podcast. My name is Ewa Domarecka and I'll be talking to you again. How are you doing today? I hope everyone's in good spirits and enjoying this beautiful sunny spring. Although I have to say, it could be a little warmer, couldn't it? Easter this year was actually really cold, but I'm sure those warm and sunny days are just around the corner. Anyway, this podcast, my dear listeners, is especially dedicated to people working in international environments who need to communicate in English. My idea is to help you expand your business English vocabulary, raise your awareness of how English communication actually works, and simply bring some language practice into your daily life. So, if you have a few spare minutes, you are warmly invited. You can listen to this podcast while cooking, jogging, driving, or going to work by bus or train. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty of today's episode and take a closer look at what I'm going to talk about. I've been really looking forward to this one because the topic is important and interesting, and I believe many of you will find it relevant. What I want to focus on today is how English actually works in practice, and that is in the directness of English communication, especially in British contexts, and how people from more direct cultures like us, the Poles, often misunderstand what native speakers really mean. I'm sure many of you have experienced situations that felt a bit off, slightly confusing, maybe even frustrating. Because there is this common belief that once your English is good enough, grammar sorted, vocabulary pretty strong, pronunciation clear, okay, job done, and then you step into a real professional environment, meetings, conversations, everyday interactions, and suddenly something doesn't quite add up. You understand the words, yes, you really do. And yet, you are not always sure what people actually mean. Why? Because English, especially British English, isn't just a language that consists of words and grammar. It's a system of communication built on nuance, context, and a very particular way of thinking. Things are rarely said directly and often kind of sugar-coated. Opinions are softened, feedback is carefully robbed, and sometimes what sounds like a suggestion is already a decision. Well, we often say that English is polite and that people are nice. But nice and kind are not the same thing. And in a British context, being kind doesn't mean being direct. But it also doesn't mean avoiding the truth. It means saying what needs to be said in a way that leaves, I would say, enough space. Space for the other person to respond, maybe to reflect and stay in the conversation. So instead of saying this doesn't work, you might hear, I'm wondering if we might need to look at this again. Now, if you take this literally, it might sound like a suggestion, something optional, perhaps something you can consider. But in reality, this is often a very clear signal, and what the speaker is doing here is being kind. They are not attacking your idea, they are not shutting you down, but they are telling you something needs to change. They are giving you space to adjust without putting you on the spot. And that's exactly how this should be received, not as a loose suggestion, but as a carefully delivered message. Think about a simple example. A friend asks for feedback on a presentation. Being nice? It was great, really good job. Being kind? You've got strong ideas here, but I'm not sure this will land with your audience. One feels better, the other actually helps. And here's the uncomfortable part. Being nice can sometimes be unhelpful, even harmful. Because when it's not fully genuine, it keeps everything on the surface. People smile, agree, nod. But nothing really improves, and many of us were taught exactly this. Don't rock the boat, don't upset anyone, keep things pleasant, but over time, that creates confusion. Because again, on the surface, everything sounds polite, measured, agreeable, but underneath there is meaning that isn't stated directly. And this becomes very clear in simple situations. Imagine you go to a restaurant, everything goes wrong, and at the end someone asks, "Was everything okay?" And you say, "Yes, lovely, thank you." That's nice, but it's not kind, because nothing changes. And in business, this is exactly the point. It's not about being nice, it's about being kind in a way that is professional and responsible. Because being kind means addressing what actually needs attention so that things can actually improve, just not always in a direct way. You can see this quite clearly in English, especially in British contexts, where professionalism is often expressed through a more indirect, more considered way of speaking. So what I'm getting at is that we need to learn how to communicate in a way that is thoughtful and constructive rather than simply direct, as this is exactly how communication often works in professional environments. We soften, we hold back, we say less than we mean. And yes, for non-native speakers, this is one of the most challenging aspects, because now you are not just dealing with language, you are dealing with meaning that isn't said directly. Understatement, cultural references, subtle humor, and even irony, which isn't always easy to pick up on. Interestingly enough, subtle humor and irony are actually very common in British English, even in business contexts. And all these layers of communication are implied rather than stated, so you might catch yourself asking for clarification more often than you expected, or missing the moment when a joke was made, or realizing a bit too late that someone said something slightly sarcastic. And then there is the bigger picture, social context, background, the invisible rules that shape how people speak, how they listen, and how they interpret what's being said. All of this creates an environment where meaning isn't always explicit. So again, it's often between the lines. And if you didn't grow up in that system, you are not missing the language, you are missing the code. And once you start seeing it, you don't just understand English better, you start understanding people. And this is actually the point where language meets culture. Well, I often share this thought with my students. When you are learning any foreign language, one very important aspect is undoubtedly culture. And obviously, I don't particularly mean the history or traditions of the country, although I believe these are also important and useful to know, as to an extent they have shaped the language in many ways. I'm talking about the nuts and bolts of how the language actually works in practice, the cultural elements that create the way it's used and understood. As you know, guys, I teach business English to professionals on a daily basis. I've been working with leaders, managers, CEOs, and specialists of different professions. And most of my students mention how confusing English communication can be in business environments, especially at higher levels of seniority. As Poles, we are generally known as being quite direct in communication. So from our perspective, English communication can sometimes seem problematic, mainly due to its indirectness and vagueness. The underlying cultural difference is that in English you communicate indirectly, particularly when it comes to negative things, whereas we tend to communicate negative things very openly. We tend to name a problem if it exists, or sometimes even when it doesn't, just in case. We are taught not to beat about the bush, so the moment we identify a problem, without mincing words, we come up with an instant remark that something is not working the way we would expect it to work. In English style of communication, negative things are signaled in a different, more subtle way. Disagreement, disappointment, or disapproval are expressed through euphemisms, which means that what you hear is not exactly what they actually mean. Negative information is minimized, so you might interpret the message as something positive and friendly, when in reality they have just informed you that they don't really like it. and in this peculiar way, they have just declined your offer. In the UK, a very normal way of expressing disappointment or disapproval is through a friendly, sugar-coated approach, from apologizing to someone who has just bumped into you and spilled coffee all over your suit, to thanking the person who has just given you a terrible haircut. The indirect approach is commonly associated with formal situations and is absolutely crucial if you want to be accepted, whether you are attending a business meeting or making a complaint about the ugliest hotel you've ever stayed in. Generally, direct language is a no-no. It is often perceived as rude and demanding, even when you include the word please. If you go in with a simple, "Can you give me a refund, please?" or even worse, "I want a refund," you will most likely go home with nothing. This kind of phrasing requires reworking. So you might want to say, "Would it be possible to get a refund?" Or, "Could I please have a refund?" So a good rule of thumb is to sound more polite and considerate when making a request, because politeness is not only about being perceived more favorably, it also increases the likelihood of getting what you actually want. Well, I know it may sound complicated. Many of my students ask me whether English people are simply more polite than we are, or whether they are trained to be more polite from a young age. Well, not exactly. The Brits simply tend to have difficulty being direct. Of course, that doesn't apply to absolutely everyone. Some people, and I've come across them myself, can be surprisingly, even uncomfortably direct, sometimes to the point of sounding outright rude. That can come from a sense of superiority or from a belief that being direct is the same as being authentic. But for the most part, directness is not something people feel entirely comfortable with. There is often a certain kind of reluctance or hesitation to say things too plainly. In many ways, this is simply seen as a national characteristic, something almost endearing, something that people from other cultures tend to notice and sometimes even joke about. I'm more than sure you've encountered this idea before, that when the British say something, then they don't always mean it in a literal way. So when you hear, "That's quite good," it may in fact suggest that something is slightly disappointing. Or when somebody says, "Very interesting," it can signal doubt rather than genuine curiosity. And when you hear, "I'm sure that's my fault," it doesn't always mean responsibility is actually being taken. Look, even a phrase like "with all due respect" often introduces clear disagreement rather than respect. And from within this cultural context, this way of speaking is understood as politeness. It is associated with good manners, consideration, and an awareness of other people's feelings and personal space. But what counts as polite is always culturally defined. And in a professional setting, this becomes particularly important because at work, clarity is not optional. People need to understand what is expected of them, and they need to feel certain about where they stand. When clarity is missing, something begins to shift. Expectations become less precise, responsibilities become less visible, and communication becomes increasingly open to interpretation. Instead of clear direction, you often hear something softer, less explicit. A suggestion rather than an instruction, a comment rather than a decision, and quite often a remark that carries a hint of irony or sarcasm. And oh yes, this is something much more complex. Because sarcasm, when it replaces clarity, doesn't actually solve the problem. It can come across as humor or as a form of mild criticism, or sometimes as nothing particularly meaningful at all. But what it often lacks is a clear indication of what should actually happen next. So yes, the message is still there, but it becomes blurred, and over time, this brings about consequences. When communication relies too heavily on indirectness, misunderstandings become more likely. Intentions are harder to interpret, and people begin to rely on guesswork rather than certainty. And when that happens, trust can slowly begin to erode. Not because people are being deliberately unclear, but because the message itself is not being expressed in a way that is easy to grasp. And every now and then, something breaks that pattern. Someone chooses to speak more directly, more explicitly. And that's often the moment when it is perceived as rude. Not necessarily because of what is being said, but because of how different it feels from what people are accustomed to. You see, it disrupts the usual pattern of softening. It breaks away from that habit of indirectness and removes the need to read between the lines. And in a communication style that relies so heavily on nuance, that kind of shift can feel unexpectedly sharp. So when we talk about rudeness in English communication, we are not always referring to aggressive language. More often than not, what people react to is simply directness entering a system that isn't used to it. The reality is that quite often when Brits are dissatisfied with a service, they are actually quite capable of voicing a complaint in a fairly direct way. But at the same time, in many everyday situations, you'll find them being remarkably friendly, especially in more impersonal interactions. I'd say this functions as a sort of social lubricant, something that helps things run more smoothly and helps avoid unnecessary tension or discomfort. So again, one recurring theme in British behaviour is the strong tendency to avoid conflict and confrontation whenever possible. They are also well known for apologising very frequently. The average Brit will say sorry countless times throughout their life, often in situations where they don't actually mean it in a literal sense. And I know many of us would look at this and think, isn't that a bit duplicitous? I've experienced this myself on several occasions in the UK. For example, when I accidentally bumped into someone or stepped on someone's foot, they would often say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm terribly sorry," or "That's my fault." And then you think, why on earth do they think it was their fault when I was the one who stepped on their foot? It was obviously my fault. And this becomes even more interesting in a business situation. Imagine this. You arrange for an expensive order to be delivered to your company, but you accidentally give the wrong address. The delivery doesn't arrive, your boss clearly getting impatient, and eventually he asks, "Where is that order?" And you say, "It was supposed to arrive last week." And he replies, "Well, it definitely hasn't arrived yet." So you go back and check the details and you realize you gave the courier the wrong company address. And then he says, "Oh, that's the wrong address." And at that point you think, oh God, your heart racing with a knot in your stomach. So you go into his office and say, "Hey, I just wanted to say I'm really sorry about the delivery situation. I don't know how I got the company address wrong. I'm really sorry about the confusion, especially as it was such an expensive order." And he goes, "Oh, no, don't worry. I'm sure it was my fault. I must not have been clear enough about which address I wanted the delivery sent to." And again, it makes no logical sense. At this point, you start thinking, but what other address could he possibly mean? We are talking about the company address. There is one official address. So what exactly is he referring to? His home address, his parents' address, his in-laws? There is no real ambiguity here. And yet, culturally, it makes perfect sense. So this brings us to something very important. Everything is in the intonation. That's quite good. That's quite good, actually. Depending on how you say it, the meaning can change completely. It might mean, this is genuinely quite good, or it might mean, this is a bit disappointing. And I'm well aware that putting it like this in writing is slightly unfair, because it doesn't fully capture the nuance we naturally use when we speak. But what it highlights very clearly is that English isn't just something you know, it's something you perform. It's not only about vocabulary or grammar, it's about how you deliver what you say. And that really matters. So it's important to keep in mind that when you are communicating in another language, it's not just about choosing the right words, but also about how those words come across. Intonation shapes meaning. It builds context. It shapes how your message is understood. Now, moving on to another example. Oh, incidentally, or oh, by the way, both phrases introduce additional information. They tend to sound like an afterthought, something minor, something not particularly important. So you might hear something like this. Can I just have a quick word with you? Yeah, all right then. So I just wanted to check something with you about a client meeting next week. I was wondering if you'd already confirmed the time with them. And you say something like, yeah, I spoke to them yesterday. We are set for 10 a.m. Great, perfect. Okay, that sounds good. Thanks for that. And then suddenly, oh, just by the way, just before I forget, could you get the report on my desk by the end of the day, please? I'd like to be able to run with it in the morning. So, as you see, incidentally or by the way, make it sound like a minor addition, but in fact, most of the time, this is the most important part of the conversation. And yes, sometimes you might realize that this was actually the main reason for the conversation from the start, but it's not always that straightforward. I've got another one for you. Well, I'll certainly bear it in mind. Notice the word certainly. It sounds pretty reassuring, and the whole sentence gives you the impression of agreement. You get a signal of willingness and future action. It sounds like agreement, or maybe even a sort of commitment. But in reality, it very often means, I don't think I'll do it. For example, would you mind if I include a short segment recognizing recent promotions and employee awards in our next update meeting? And the response is, well, we don't normally do that, but I'll bear it in mind. And you think, okay then, they might agree. But very often what it really means is no. It is similar to saying, I'll definitely consider it. It sounds strong and quite promising. But in fact, there is no commitment at all. It simply means, I'll think about it, and that's it. So on balance, what we are looking at here is not a problem of language, but a difference in how meaning is created and interpreted. Because for many of us, being direct simply feels respectful. You say things clearly, you get to the point, and the other person doesn't have to guess what you really meant, or work their way through layers of ambiguity, or decode what feels like a bit of a riddle. In a way, we often feel we are doing them a favor, but in a British context, the logic works differently. Respect is shown through the way a message is delivered, not through how directly it's expressed. So instead of putting everything on the table, they soften the edges, they leave a bit of room, and they expect you to read between the lines. And this is where things can start to feel confusing for us. Because from our perspective, this way of communicating can feel unclear, sometimes even a bit disingenuous, or at times bordering on hypocrisy. And upon reflection, we may say that to an extent they feign interest. They might sound engaged, as if they'd like to continue their interaction, as if they are showing concern, even when it's not necessarily the case. Nevertheless, the Brits love sugarcoating their social life, and phrases like, "It's nice to meet you," are not always meant exactly as they sound. They often serve a different purpose: to keep the interaction smooth, pleasant, and non-confrontational. And that's why this is not really about taking things at face value, because it's not only about the words themselves, but about how meaning is actually created and understood. It comes down to how you interpret intention, how you pick up on tone, and how you make sense of what sits beneath the words. Because once that perspective shifts, a lot of things start to fall into place. And conversations that once felt confusing suddenly become much easier to navigate. And this is exactly the kind of awareness that can be developed once you know what to look for. And if you're interested in exploring this further in a business context, this is exactly what I focus on in my podbook, the Strategic Business English Collection. Because in business, it's not enough to know the language. You need to know how to use it effectively and appropriately, how to communicate in a way that is aligned with your intention, and importantly, how to manage diplomacy in real situations. So in my podbook, I take you through real contexts, real conversations, and real problems, the kind that don't come from lack of vocabulary, but from the way something is said. Because again, very often what affects your professional image is not your level of English, but the gap between what you mean and how your message is received. You might be clear in your intention, but sound too direct. You might be polite, but still not fully understood. And this is where another layer becomes important. Because English-speaking environments operate in a more high-context way, which means that not everything is said directly. So even if you don't completely change your own communication style, what really matters is that you start understanding how to interpret others, how to read between the lines, how to pick up on what is implied, not just what is said. And once you develop that awareness, you stop reacting only to words and start responding to meaning. So yes, if you want to communicate in a way that is not only correct but also effective and fully aligned with how you want to be perceived, you'll find all of that in my podbook, the Strategic Business English Collection. And by the way, here's a big shout out to all of you who are already learning with it. It clearly went down really well, as I've received plenty of messages from you saying how useful you found the podbook. The podbook is designed to help you understand not just what to say, but how to think in business English, so that your message lands the way you intend it to. Inside the podbook, you'll find dedicated sections focused on language you can actually use in different business conversations, language that sounds intelligent, mature, and diplomatic rather than stiff or over-rehearsed. Very importantly, you'll take a close look at the most common mistakes people make during business meetings or job interviews, often without even realizing it, and at how small shifts in wording or tone can completely change how you are perceived. There is also a very interesting section devoted to the elevator pitch. How to make a strong, memorable impression in just 30 seconds. I break the structure down step by step, introduce carefully selected words and expressions, and share practical tips that help you sound confident without sounding forced. I also spend quite a bit of time on the language of diplomacy in business, including assertiveness in professional situations, helping you understand where the line sits and how easily it can be crossed. Because when assertiveness turns into pressure or rigidity, it can backfire, damage relationships, and quietly undermine your professional image. Another key aspect in the podbook is formality, something many people generally struggle with. How formal is formal enough? And when does professional start to sound distant or unnatural? I go into this in detail using real-life examples, ready-made phrases, and short dialogues to show how this works in practice. Alongside all of this, you'll also find carefully designed exercises that help you understand not only what a phrase means, but when and why to use it, so new language sticks because it's learned in the right context. As a bonus, I've included plenty of vocabulary sections with practice, especially for those of you who want to challenge yourselves and take things a step further. So all in all, my dear listeners, the podbook goes much deeper into business English. You get over 100 pages of highly practical content, insights, detailed analyses, case studies, as well as interesting observations on the language of business and politics, alongside carefully designed exercises that help you apply what you learn, so you can use the language of business effectively while avoiding confusion and misinterpretation. I've included a link to my podbook in the description of this episode, so it's the easiest way to find it. And it's also available on my Instagram. You'll find it in my bio. Okay then, folks, that's the end of this episode. Thank you so much for joining me today on Biznesowo po angielsku. If you found this episode useful and valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share it with your friends, and let me know what you think in the comments. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.